E3 2017. Boy, was it a shit show. Don't misunderstand, I didn't regret attending the event. I got to meet some cool people, see some cool things, and it was a worthwhile trip. But in terms of the show itself, the press conferences and the show floor, this was the worst E3 in recent memory. Now, having attended E3 only once before, back in 2015 before Phantom Pain came out, I thought I was going crazy by having these thoughts. But then I talked to a bunch of people who have been attending E3 for a while now, and they all agree that there was something off about this year, with many calling it the worst one in recent memory. Let's start with the press conferences. None of the press conferences this year blew me away in any way. EA's was a complete embarrassment, with its constant plug-in of sports and this little infamous bit.
What up, guys? Thank you for having me, EA. If you guys don't know who I am, my name is Jesse Wellens, and I am a YouTube creator. So I am here to talk about Need for Speed Payback. If you guys didn't know, Need for Speed Payback, yeah, it's a great game. But all right, all set aside, I'm a YouTube creator. Need for Speed Payback, it's coming out. I got my boy Marcus, executive producer here. He is the producer of the game. Thank you, Nick, for having me.
Microsoft showed a bunch of games, but a lot of them weren't all that interesting, and they didn't do a good job of convincing me that I need an Xbox One X in my life. Bethesda's live press conference felt completely unnecessary for what little they had to show. They should have gone for like a Nintendo Direct style presentation or something. Ubisoft's press conference was actually pretty decent and brought some spark of life to E3 2017. It flowed really well, kicking things off with an awesome appearance by Shigeru Miyamoto. They also showed a good combination of both already announced titles as well as new surprises. Overall, Ubisoft's press conference felt the closest to what I would call a traditional, well-executed conference. Sony's conference was a little weird this year. Sean Layden just kind of came out and said, "Hey guys, games," and then from there it was just a barrage of trailers, and before I knew it, it was over. The pacing of the conference and the order in which they showed games was just really off, especially with the way how the grand finale was the Spider-Man game. There was also a general lack of on-stage showmanship. Major first-party titles were missing, and there was a general absence of surprises or new announcements. Sony's conference wasn't bad per se, but it lacked a little soul and it felt rushed in how it was put together. Finally, Nintendo's tried and true Direct delivered a short but sweet showcase of some of Switch's upcoming titles. There was just enough content for the format that they went for, and surprises like the Metroid Prime 4 announcement and mention of a new Pokemon game coming to Nintendo Switch was the cherry on top. So yeah, there were your bad conferences and there were your good ones, but this year, none of them really blew me away. There's usually one conference at each E3 that leaves me ecstatic, but E3 2017 was one of those rare cases where none of the conferences really struck a chord with me. The one time I genuinely screamed in joy was when Nintendo announced Metroid Prime 4, because I've been waiting for that for so long, but that's about it. So all in all, I was left disappointed with E3 2017's press conferences, but I figured maybe the show floor will make up for it. But that's when E3 2017 went from disappointing to a real shit show. Let's start with the fact that the Entertainment Software Association, or the ESA, sold 15,000 tickets to the public. Just to give you some perspective, around 50,000 people attended E3 2016, while around 68,000 people attended E3 2017. That's 18,000 more people than last time, and no adjustments were made to the show floor to compensate for the bigger crowd. Same old kitchen as last time, but with more people crammed in. Imagine if a restaurant suddenly decided to allow customers to walk in the kitchen and try out some food samples, all without changing the structure and system of the kitchen itself. In such a scenario, the chefs wouldn't be able to do their jobs, and the customers wouldn't really have an optimal time walking around this hot, crowded kitchen. E3 2017 was kinda like that. It was a bit of a free-for-all. Just pure disorganized chaos due to a crowd size that the show was just not prepared to handle. It's no secret that the ESA has been trying to outdo themselves every year in terms of E3 attendees. But in their greed, what they don't seem to realize is that after you cross a certain threshold, the whole experience becomes detrimental to all groups of attendees. For the public, lines got way bigger and the wait way more arduous, especially without any changes to demo sizes or demo station quantities. For media, they had much less room to work with, and everything at the show floor became far less accessible for coverage. Obviously, if you're a big media conglomerate like IGN or GameSpot, you're gonna get special access, but for a mid-range YouTuber like myself and many others, the media badge did jack shit this year. Just about every media badge holder I've talked to at this year's E3, both E3 newcomers and E3 veterans, have told me the same thing. It was hard to get anything done this year. Apparently, there used to be a time where you could just present your media badge and set up some kind of appointment for a play session on the show floor. But in E3 2017, due to how overcrowded it was, media accommodations were almost non-existent, hampering their ability to do their jobs. Website Kotaku explained it perfectly in a recent article that they published about the matter, and there are 2 quotes I would like to present that perfectly summarizes how I felt. Many attendees were still there mostly for business, but others were purely for pleasure, and E3 was stuck, or rather wedged, in the middle. There were, however, no special days focused on business before the floodgates opened, a la Gamescom in Germany, and there was little delineation between spaces open to the public and spaces reserved for private meetings and events. Couldn't have said it better myself. So what we have here with E3 2017 is a no-win situation. The public didn't get to try out many games, and the media didn't get much done. It was a clusterfuck for everyone. By the end of day 1 of E3 2017, I realized that if I continued approaching the event as work, I was going to be miserable for the rest of this disorganized mess. So for days 2 and 3, my brother and I decided that we would change our approach. Instead of focusing on work, we decided we would focus on having fun, meeting people, sightseeing, and whatnot. And it's only once I got into that mindset that I began enjoying E3 2017. It was with this mentality that on day 2 of E3 2017, I headed over to watch the Hideo Kojima E3 Coliseum panel live instead of via live stream. Best choice I ever made. I got to meet some fans, some like-minded people, and it was on my way to the panel that I actually got to briefly meet Hideo Kojima and low-key say hi. Sure, we didn't get much new information in the panel itself, but it was still fun, cool, and relaxing to just be there live. We also decided to approach playing games on the show floor differently. Instead of going for the big budget games that would be good to cover for my channel, we decided to walk around and play whatever games we were personally interested in and whatever caught our attention. Games that I got to try out include Mario Odyssey, my personal game of the show, Ni no Kuni 2, a beautiful JRPG that I've always wanted to check out, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, a surprisingly fun and deep tactics game, Dragon Ball FighterZ, the best looking and playing Dragon Ball game in years, Yakuza 6, fun sandbox open world insanity, Forza Motorsport 7 with the full driving rig, which was less immersive and more nausea-inducing, and a few other smaller games scattered about. I was also invited to try out Metal Gear Survive, the impressions of which I shared in some of my previous videos. So I didn't get to try out your big AAA titles like Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, Far Cry 5, Star Wars Battlefront 2, Destiny, and whatnot. But I really didn't want to. I actually am not all that interested in those games. I'm not saying they will be bad games, it's just I didn't think they were worth lining up hours for. They weren't that interesting. And to be honest with you, throughout all of E3 2017, there just weren't many games that I was really excited to try out. I soon realized that another reason why E3 2017 felt like such a shit show was because this year's selection of compelling playable titles was paltry compared to years past. And because of how overcrowded E3 was this year, the lines for these games were unprecedented, giving me even less reason to want to try out these games. Talking to a bunch of people, there was just a general lack of excitement for the playable titles that were available on the show floor. I would say the only exception to that was Mario Odyssey, which is why it's my personal game of the show. This game really blew my mind with its creativity in the short 10 minutes demo that I got to play. Now, as I hopped from game to game, I also began to see the toll that E3 2017's overpopulation began to have on the show floor and its booths. It was easy to tell that no booth was really fully prepared for this kind of crowd. Sony in particular really dropped the ball on how they handled the whole situation. First of all, their selection of playable titles was incredibly lackluster. They had some stations set up for your typical Call of Duties and your Destinies, but I was more interested in PlayStation exclusives or first-party titles. On that front, they had, Detroit Become Human and Knack 2? And that's about it. Their more exciting first-party games like God of War, Uncharted Lost Legacy, Days Gone, and the new Spider-Man game were not playable. Sony had the biggest booth at E3 2017, and yet theirs felt like the smallest. That's probably because a lot of that space was wasted on closed theaters where they presented eyes-only demos of their more anticipated first-party titles like God of War, Uncharted, Days Gone, Spider-Man, etc. But as far as hands-on stations go, PlayStations, if you will, it was a pretty sad affair. There should have been more hands-on stations set up. And it didn't help that, again, the selection of playable titles was just incredibly lackluster. Now, where things go from bad to worse for Sony is in how they handled play session queues this year. Instead of having people line up for their desired game as is traditional, Sony decided to rely on this app that people had to download on their smart devices and use that to RSVP play sessions. That's right, everything on Sony's booth, even the stuff for the public, was all RSVP. Reservations on the app would open up at 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. every day, and it was up to you to keep track of time, get on that app, and use it to reserve a play session before all of the slots were taken up. But there were a number of problems with this approach. Let's start with the fact that nobody knew about this app when they arrived at the show floor. Sony made no conceited effort to communicate information about the app or their new RSVP system. So the confusion at Sony's booth on day one of E3 2017 was palpable. For those who did manage to find, download, and figure out the app, they quickly learned just how limited the number of play session slots were. Everything was pretty much full every day, all day. Now, the app did tell you that reservations open at specific times. 9 a.m. for morning sessions and 1 p.m. for afternoon sessions. But as you might expect, everyone had their apps ready, waiting until the clock struck exactly 9 a.m. or 1 p.m. so that they can make their reservations on the dot. But with 68,000 attendees, that app was handling tens of thousands of people at a time. Way too much traffic for the app servers to handle. So as soon as the clock struck 9 a.m. or 1 p.m., the app would just freeze. You hit the button and nothing would happen, or the app would get stuck on a loading screen. And by the time it finished loading, like 2 minutes later, all of the slots would be taken up. So whether you got to play a game at Sony's booth depended on a number of things. Your ability to keep track of time, the itchiness of your trigger finger, your phone's processing speed, and your phone's internet speed. It was straight up trying to win the lottery, and people from both media and the public were pissed about this system. Oh, and if for whatever reason you don't have a smartphone, too bad. You can't play games at Sony's booth. And look, I get what Sony was going for here. They were trying to mitigate long lines in an overcrowded environment. But with lines, at least everyone has a chance. With this RSVP app system, getting a chance to play one of these games was damn near impossible. The app just couldn't handle E3 2017's crowd, and Sony simply did not set up enough stations and time slots to allow but a fraction of the 68,000 attendees to be able to get their hands on some of Sony's games. Once everyone realized this, they all just stopped going to Sony's booth. What was the point after all? There was no reason to be at Sony's booth for more than a few minutes unless by some miracle you managed to RSVP a play session. Combine this level of inaccessibility and inefficient use of booth space with the paltry selection of playable titles, and you've got what was easily the worst booth of E3 2017. Sony really dropped the ball on this one. Nintendo, on the other hand, was a completely different story. They had the second largest booth at the show floor, but unlike Sony, most of that space was dedicated to setting up hands-on stations for people to try out their most compelling first-party title, Mario Odyssey. No stupid app required. All people had to do was line up, wait for maybe an hour, get their hands on the game for like 10 minutes, and that was it. You get in, get out. It was easy, simple, and accessible. Nintendo did struggle a bit with keeping lines organized in day 1, but by days 2 and 3, they were on top of that shit. I would say that Nintendo easily had the best booth of E3 2017. It was beautifully crafted with the Mario Odyssey motif. It was well organized. Their best first-party title was playable en masse, and the whole booth was just brimming with life. From there, I would say that Ubisoft had the second best booth, mainly because of the varied selection of playable titles. Unlike Sony, many of the awesome titles that Ubisoft showed off during their press conference were all playable. You could line up for Assassin's Creed, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, Far Cry 5, the new Pirates game Skull and Bones, The Crew 2, you name it, they were all there. I also stopped by Microsoft's booth, and it was well organized, and there was a good selection of playable titles, but much like their press conference, a lot of those titles were just not all that interesting. There was no killer first-party title worth lining up for. I did try Forza Motorsport 7 because they had the full rig setup and it looked really cool, but I actually had a pretty bad time with that. It didn't feel anything like a car, it just kind of shook you around like a piñata, and I was more nauseated than anything by the end of the session. Then there's Bethesda's booth, which offered what I would call a humble selection of notable titles. I was mainly interested in checking out their VR games, Fallout 4, Skyrim, and Doom. But with only 4 VR stations set up and an insane line to get through, I didn't even bother. They also had this really cool Wolfenstein 2 booth that was built to look like a diner, but I wasn't so interested in that game that I was willing to wait like 3 hours on their ridiculous line. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I think I've covered all of the major booths at the show floor. If I had to choose a winner for E3 based on both their press conference performance and the show floor experience, I would say that Nintendo was the clear winner. From there, I would say that Ubisoft was second, Microsoft and Bethesda come tied in third, Sony comes in fourth, and EA comes in last. Again, this is all combining their press conference performance and the show floor experience. But regardless of booth, one thing that they all shared in common was a constant sense that this year's E3 was simply far too crowded. I can't speak for everyone, but the general consensus is that the public had a hard time getting their hands on games, and the media had a hard time doing their jobs. And talking to a lot of people, I got the sense that most of them just weren't all that excited about E3 2017's selection of playable titles. But a lackluster selection of games aside, what the ESA really needs to figure out is how to structure E3 better. It's a matter of both safety and efficiency for attendees. I'm sure that the 68,000 attendees figure and the revenue from the 15,000 tickets that they sold to the public at $150 to $250 each is all very enticing to the ESA. But they need to realize that the pot boiled over this year. They need to take a long, hard look at the clusterfuck that was E3 2017 and figure out what went wrong, and more importantly, what exactly they want E3 to be. Is it a trade show for business and media coverage, or is it an exhibition for the public? Because E3 2017 did not convince me that you can do both at the same time. I'm not against the idea, it just didn't work this year, so they either need to step back and go back to an old tried and true formula, or they need to figure out how the hell they can make this work. If they want to bring in the public again, they need to change their approach. For starters, there needs to be a clear delineation between the public and the media. Maybe set aside a few business days before you open the floodgates for the public. Because you can't just have 2 different groups of people who are there for 2 different purposes, all occupying one space. It's a recipe for chaos. At a restaurant, you wouldn't have people walk in the kitchen willy-nilly. There's a reason the kitchen and the tables are in separate spaces. They are all there for the restaurant experience, but they're also there for different purposes. They also need to bring down the number of attendees, make the show floor bigger, or restructure the show floor, or move to a larger venue. The LA Convention Center simply cannot handle 68,000 people, not in an environment like E3 anyway. Either make some kind of substantial change to compensate for the additional population, or keep E3 focused on allowing the media to do their jobs. And look, I'm not one of those self-entitled people who scorns the idea of the public attending E3 or anything, but I do think E3 has lost focus. I just don't know what the show is anymore. In trying to be everything, E3 2017 did well at nothing. They need to reel it back in and define an identity for the show. So in summary, the absence of any outstanding press conferences, a general lack of exciting or surprising playable titles at the show floor, the overabundance of attendees, and the adverse effects that this overpopulation had on the show floor and all of the booths made E3 2017 a complete shit show, and one of the worst ones, if not the worst one, in recent memory. That's not to say that my trip to LA wasn't a worthwhile one. Meeting fans and friends, briefly meeting the likes of Jeff Keighley, Ken Imaizumi, and Hideo Kojima, hanging out with my brother, sightseeing, playing games out of interest and not obligation. It's all the little things that made E3 2017 worthwhile. My tip to anyone who plans to attend E3 in the near future is to make E3 your own. If you're attending for pleasure, go around, meet people, have fun, and don't feel obligated to play all of the big games. Honestly, it's the smaller gestures of E3 that make the experience worthwhile. If you're there for work like I was, do what you need to do, but also go with the mindset that this is as much for you as it is for your audience. So yeah, keep those things in mind, make E3 your own, and you should have a good amount of fun. It has its good sides and its bad sides, but there is definitely no experience like it. Now, as worthwhile as attending E3 2017 was, I hope to never have to experience a shit show like that again. So either find a way to meld the public and the media correctly, or don't do it at all and go back to focusing on media, is my take on all of this. So better organization, better structure, and better games for E3 2018. Please. So yeah, that's it for my E3 2017 summary and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy my content, consider supporting me on Patreon so we can remain independent from third-party sponsorship and corporate interference. Also, if you have any thoughts about what you think E3 should be, drop a comment below. And to be further updated on all things video game news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.